Hello again, Brittany.
Hi, Francis. Hi, Rose. Hi, how are you? Good. How are you?
Moment.
Live. I'm using Zoom. I'm still not used to Zoom for some reason. I don't know why. After how many months of this? But hello.
6 months.
Oh boy.
Wow.
Wow.
It
Okay.
feels like so much longer than just 6 months.
It really does. So that. Live discussion. I feel like every time I post on social media, it has to start with "I'm alive." Am I the only person?
I don't post, so
Yeah, right.
maybe
Percent.
maybe I should.
Yeah.
And maybe we should wait for to see if we get some more viewers. We're up to like 7 or something.
Oh, nice.
Hello, people of the internet. Welcome to our awesome book club. It's so cool. It's lit. There you go. Just splice that as our introduction.
That sounds perfect.
It's lit, kids. You're gonna love it. We're very hip. The problem is that it's such a good name, though.
Yeah, and we totally made it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an original name.
It was original when we thought of it, right? Who knew other people maybe literature. It's lit literature. It makes sense. It all makes sense. Where it's lit, we're part of the In the Margin Theater Company, and we're the group that likes talking about stuff based on literature. So it's lit, right?
Yes. Should we go around saying our names and preferred pronouns?
I think that's excellent. Yeah.
Okay. I can start us off. I am Brittany. She, her, hers.
I am Fran, they, them, theirs.
I'm Jasmine, she, her, hers.
And I'm Rose, she, her, hers.
Should we do a check-in before starting the conversation about the new Jim Crow?
Yes.
Okay. I will pull it up. So I thought we could go with the book theme of what type of reader we are.
Oh.
Or we could pick one that totally is not on there. That is also an option. Mine is definitely guys for the pretty cover. What about you, Fran?
I would say the never completes because I start and then restart and restart again.
I was going to say that too, not because I necessarily lose interest, but just because I gain interest in something else.
Yeah.
So I read like 100 pages of this, and then I'm like, oh my God, what is this? And then I buy 4 new books. And I'm like, wait, I never finished, but I have to start this. Oh my God.
Like I've definitely read some of all the books I've bought. I just haven't finished all of them, you know?
Right. I'm both of the two that everybody's mentioned because I'm notorious for buying especially graphic novels for the pretty cover and displaying them, but not finishing the series. And then I too, I fall victim to the same thing of really getting into the book, but then I just don't. I have that problem with TV shows even, but especially with books. I always thought if I met Tina Fey, I would tell her that I have read her I have read 3/5 of her memoir 3 times. Very specific.
It would go, cool.
Yeah. Like, please hire me.
Fran, are you saying something because you're muted?
Yeah, I know. I just realized the music. I just said, thank you for the check-in. It's good to know. Like, I mean, it's good to know what type of reader I am because then I know maybe I shouldn't buy another book, you know. But that's difficult. Like, you can't just not buy another book.
It's hard not to, and especially like when you hear like the synopsis of a book, that totally happens to me, and I'm like, okay, I have to read it. And then even more so if it has a pretty cover.
So today we're talking about the new Jim Crow. So that's exciting, right? Brittany, you had some images that we could go off of, right?
Yeah. Unless there's anything that really stood out for them, if they want to start the discussion.
No, I think it would be great to start with those images, especially if there are people watching that haven't read the book, you know, just to get an idea of just the general concepts.
All right, let me pull those up. All right. Can everyone see it on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't even know where to start with this. I guess what stands out for us, maybe in comparison to the book.
I mean, there's so much in this, right? Like I'm looking at like the sign on the bottom right that says schoolhouse.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's just like one of the details of the many. This one image.
I think for me is the union and then showing like the eagle. It's almost like, and the layers of it, it kind of goes with of like the foundation of when America was started up until now, and it's still under that flag, I guess.
I think the phrase worse than slavery is really interesting because it's such a loaded phrase, because my first instinct would be, oh my God, what's worse than slavery? But I think the idea here, at least my interpretation is, especially in relation to the book, of saying that slavery was one form of oppression, and it was very blatant and obvious. But as time goes on, those prejudices have still maintained themselves through generations, and it has just presented itself in different ways. And so perhaps one could say something that's worse than slavery is having somebody think and act a certain way because you look different than them, but that it's not so in the public eye, that it's gone through all these like back channels of making it seem like it's something else. So it's almost like harder to pinpoint your enemy and harder to say like, you are wrong, I am right. Like things are more gray when it's not so out in the open as something like slavery is.
Right. I mean, for me, it's kind of the idea. I mean, for slavery, there's obviously the people are property in the eyes of the owners, but once it was abolished, as you're kind of saying, it's harder to say or see and identify that like sense of ownership or like the entitlement to the labor or experiences of the people.
And that the thing that worse than slavery is on kind of looks like a blanket. So it's almost like it's hidden now.
Yeah, I mean, you were already getting to it, Rose, but I think like one of the quickest takeaways from the book that is already evident in this picture, especially if you were like giving somebody the short version if they hadn't read it, is that slavery never ended in America, right? I mean, it's here in big words that worse than slavery, and it's like you just said, Brittany, that it. Uh, I mean, I just remember that like really early in the book, like in the first couple pages, she said that like if history was any guide, it may have simply taken a different form, you know, and that's like constantly what it keeps coming back to. It's like how those have who want to like maintain racial majority, like like keep trying like finding new ways to oppress in like legal ways, you know, in the ways that the current system has made it like deemed it legal that they can get away with it. um that's yeah, I
And
know that's
also important to remember that these things have always been legal in some sense. Like slavery was legal, right? And so
yeah,
it's so easy to just say, "Oh, if I lived back then, I would completely be against it." But it's like it was the law, and there's a
Right.
law now that's just working in a different way. It's not exactly the same thing, but I was just looking at it last few days about all the wildfires in California, of course, and I've just seen so much information about prisoners that are being used for labor as firefighters, getting paid like $2 a day, put in extremely dangerous situations, and then they're not allowed to be hired as firefighters once they exit because they're convicted felons. It's like
yeah.
how has how can you say, well, it's the law to something like that?
And
Right.
it kind of reminds me. Oh, go ahead, Fran.
Well, yeah. So I was in the book. It mentions like the incarcerated population and that they're like disposable, and being that from your example, Rose, like a very current example
Mhm.
is like really that's that's why that's a population fighting the fires is because they're considered disposable.
And then, like what you also mentioned, they can't work because of the convicted felon. So like that label stays with them. And how can they change things around when they're so stigmatized and still the oppression stays?
Fran, were you saying that in reference to the firefighters, what you were just saying?
Yeah, so in the book, it says that for the incarcerated population, they're considered a disposable population, so they're used for in that way for labor. And so
Right.
I like that very much tied into what Rose gave for the example of prisoners being used as firefighters.
Yeah, that's yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. It's literally like they're talking about from when I mean when there was like actual Jim Crow like as law, to when now when like what the book says is essentially the new Jim Crow. It's always been the same thing. From I think they talked about like building railroads and that like they didn't even have the same protections as they did like under slavery because they were like disposable because they didn't need to like keep them afterwards, and it's like and it's literally still relevant in 2020. I mean, it's like the exact same conversation. It's wild.
And the fact that these like labels allow it to keep happening.
There were two things in the book that either shocked me or just I was very interested in.
Mhm.
One of them well, three things. One of them was not shocking. I just learned more about it, which was the war on drugs. I'd love to talk more about that.
Mm.
Another one of them is how easy it is to point out Black exceptionalism as a way to say that racism doesn't exist anymore, when really it's just a tactic to pit people of color against each other. And then the other one was I really enjoyed learning more about women's perspectives, because the author very clearly states that they are focusing mostly on Black men being incarcerated for a myriad of reasons. But like looking at the women's perspectives of who may have believed, look at all of these irresponsible Black men in my life that promised they wouldn't go to prison, promised this wouldn't happen, and it keeps happening. And then just like watching them realize and learn more about this system, to give their loved ones a little bit more grace and understanding in things that were out of their control. So I'd love to touch any of those.
Yeah. I think those are really good topics to start off with. Fran, Jasmine, would you agree?
Oh, for sure. I'm like thinking about like the women's perspective. Um, and like I've on like TikTok, I've been like my stream on that is very much like progressive, and there's one. So like yes, on topic, but kind of not, that the mirror for Black women of like police brutality is how they're treated by doctors, and not necessarily on topic of the book, but it's just kind of a reiteration of the same thing, where they don't have ownership of their bodies, or they use certain studies to just be racist, like that pain tolerance is different or something, like that. Yeah.
I think John Oliver was just talking about that. I don't know how recent that was because all the time is blurring together. But I mean, that very thing about, I mean, like, there's like a higher death rate of Black women like dying in labor than white women. And they like, even like just beyond death rates, I mean, it's like literally these like crazy preconceived notions that they have like a higher pain tolerance. So they'll like, whereas they'll give like a white woman, I mean, you know, like the hard good stuff, and then they're giving Black women in labor ibuprofen. It's, yeah, insane. And then also what you were saying about the war on drugs, one of the lines that was, I guess, something I'd already, that not like it was surprising, but just the way that she phrased it was very precise, was that the war on drugs, that the war wasn't on the drugs, right? It was on the people. That line really stuck out. And it's like, I don't even know how people, like, they still defend the war on drugs and everything, and that's still like discussed to this day. And like those, I feel like what the war on drugs has done to like a lot of generations, they still believe in some of that rhetoric and everything like that. When you literally, like, it's not from the book, but I know there was a high-ranking official from the Nixon administration who literally admitted like later in his life that was like, yeah, we criminalized like marijuana just to so we could like go after people of color, like they full on admitted it. So it's not like theory even, it's literally just true. I don't know.
But I wonder too if it like goes, even if they've admitted it, that narrative and that bias that we grow up believing. Because like I know when I read it, I was like, whoa, I didn't know how much of it was a bias for me with the war on drugs. I'm like, okay, I want to educate myself more on this.
I mean, tying that back to that narrative, I think is part of when we blame like the men, or when they're blamed, is because of that narrative. But like it's really access to opportunity. So if people are dealing the drugs, is because that's the only option they have to support their families. And that's a like, systemic issue. It's not an issue of the individual. It's an issue of what they're offered by society.
Mm-hmm.
I will say though that one of the things that I didn't realize was they mentioned that like people who deal drugs, it's like very equal like among all the races too, and that was like a huge like argument, I guess, during like the height of the war on drugs during the Nixon era and everything, was that like they're like, oh well, black people are selling drugs at a higher rate, and it's like and they said that literally it's all races and it's near equal, and also white people are consuming drugs at almost an equal rate also, and where do you think they get their drugs from? And like I think the author literally said that they're not going into the ghetto to go buy their drugs, like they, and I don't know, there's so much that should have been common sense about the war on drugs for so many people that is still not brought to light, and obviously not taught in our education system, right?
I don't know if anything about the war on drugs at all was taught in public school. I mean, because then they'd be like, don't teach them about drugs because then they'll do drugs.
Right.
Which
well, I guess the what is it, the DARE campaign? Is that what it was? So I guess that was their way of like, don't do this drug, you know, like drugs, and making it seem like a problem where like we have to educate our kids.
When the DARE program was just showed to make kids more interested in trying drugs, they'd bring around the briefcase and just feel like, oh, look at all the pretty drugs.
And then the like red ribbon.
I can't remember where I learned this, or it could have been like John Oliver, Hasan Minhaj, Vox, something like that. But it's talking about how statistics can be very misleading and lie to you. And I was like, what? It's numbers. Like, that doesn't make any sense. But it's because statistics are usually just like a one-sentence description that leave out all the variables that are unaccounted for. So, for example, it's very easy to say, they have this as an example in the book, 50% of incarcerated people are there for violent crime. Mm-hmm. But that's because the other 50% that's not rotate in and out much faster than people that are in there for violent crime with longer sentences. And the same thing could be said of like, you could say black neighborhoods have more crime. It's like, well, because there's more of a police presence, you know? So it's just interesting how I have usually been like, oh yeah, you have to trust the numbers. So when someone's like, yeah, black on black crime is like way higher, I'm like, really? Like, is that the number? I guess you have to believe the number, but it's not all about that. You have to take a look at all these other variables that are not presented within like charts.
Like people who were falsely convicted, which is very purposefully part of that statistic, right?
Yeah.
And like, you know, differing definitions of what is a violent crime, or, you know, things that should have been self-defense. And that's very true.
Yeah. And I think too, like what you said is like, you think of like, how can numbers be wrong?
Yeah.
I mean, the example they do give, the one that Rose mentioned of like people rotating in and out, like I when I read that, I also was like, whoa, like that's very misleading. They're using the statistics to mislead the public.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it goes back to like those narratives, Francis, of the misleading?
Yeah, I think the misleading like they use every single approach, right? Where they use like science to do it. They use fear. And as was mentioned, like that idea of like black elitism, to say, but we've resolved it, right? It's an issue of the community, not an issue of the public, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Where it's, which like it doesn't make sense, right? But like I that's a weird like logic that's kind of been pushed on us, is that it's not an issue of our society, it's an issue of these neighborhoods,
Hmm.
as if they're not part of our society, if they're as if they're not being like pumped with all the prejudice and the
Hmm.
discrimination and such.
Yeah.
I think that's a really difficult thing about all of this is in my life, I try really hard to not be like me versus you, us versus them. Like I'm 100% the good guy, you're 100% the bad guy. You believe and you know exactly what you're doing, that it's evil and it's like blatant and on purpose. Because that's very rarely true, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the difficult part about all this is because the head of I don't know who, but that is in charge of like redlining different cities, whatever, or the head of a bank that's not providing loans to these people of color, they're probably not saying out loud, "I hate black people and I'm going to try and make them second class citizens." It's just intrinsic. The prejudice is intrinsic in what they've been raised with in the society, right? And so it's much harder to educate or change someone's mind for something that is not conscious, for something that they would be quick to be defensive about. That I might be defensive to too if someone says, you are the reason that I didn't get a loan for my house and now we're homeless. I'd be like, whoa, 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 it's not me. It's like the system. I'm sorry, it's not my problem.
And I think too, it's like these systems probably get to stay in place because we feel uncomfortable when we talk about these topics, because people get defensive and they think, well, I'm not racist because this, and this. Or, you know,
I mean that's the point of these conversations though, right? Is because like as you mentioned, Brittany, like we were taught a very specific perspective on the war on drugs as it being like a good thing, right?
Mhm.
Like if it was mentioned, it didn't go into depth, but it wasn't like for me specifically until I was an adult and was reading things about it, and like it was becoming more well known that like wait, this was against our communities of color, that
Mhm.
I realized that prejudice I had against my own community members. And like it's definitely a work. Like we are all a little racist. We all have to work and learn to why we are and like dismantle that within ourselves. But it's difficult because it takes a lot of work.
Yeah. It takes being able to sit in the uncomfortable.
There's also the interesting aspect that I'm like growing into, which is I didn't identify as a person of color until very recently, like 2 years ago,
Mhm.
because I'm half Asian, and so there were all these things of like being mixed and model minority, whatever.
Mm,
And so that in combination, like being a different kind of POC than what it means to be black in the United States. And so it's like, why are we being pitted against each other? Like, oh, who has it worse? And then it's like, well, what, like, I'm not part of the problem because I'm also a person of color. These are all just things that I can imagine a lot of people of color in the United States are battling with as well.
Mhm.
Um, and it's becoming uh, more interesting too as I don't know, it's like in the next 50 years minorities will become the majority, like as a collective, like they will make up more than 50% of the United States. And so it's just an interesting shift, right? We're in a very interesting time for all of those. Does anybody else relate to that of what it means
No.
to struggle with your identity in that way?
I mean, yeah, specifically for sorry, I feel like we're talking. Yeah.
No, go ahead, Fran. Finish. And we
Okay.
can go around and
Well, specifically from my experience, like there's prejudice within my family against being indigenous, even though we're super like indigenous, right? And it's kind of like trying to assimilate to whiteness within like Mexican culture is a way of like survival. And it's like not until now where that is kind of being reversed and we're able to say, wait, like we have indigenous roots. And then like for me, working with like my mom to identify like, because she'll say things like, oh, the Spanish word for this is that, but our family calls it this, and it's like a native word. It's like, yes, mom, you know that because of my grandma and like and your father. Like, it's yeah. I mean, I very much do feel that like pressure of assimilation and like rejection of culture. And I know for my generation, I think we were told to embrace speaking Spanish, but I think like if I were born like say 10 years earlier, I would have been told not to.
Hmm. I totally agree with that. Like that pressure of, I think almost like a rejection from both. Like if I don't act Mexican, then it's like, oh, she's trying to be white. But then when I'm in spaces where it's, the majority white, it's like I'm just seen as Mexican. Um, but so I totally relate to that. And also like the pitting against each other. I just had a conversation with family, and it was very much of like, well, about like Black Lives Matter and explaining that whole thing because
Mm-hmm.
some of my family takes it as, well, what about us Latinos? And it's like, okay, but it's not saying that. It's just until the most marginalized are helped, then it will be beneficial to us, to everyone. So I think that pitting against each other that she talks about in the book too, of like it's another tactic from the majority to keep the marginalized marginalized.
Yeah, that's very real. Oh, talking with family right now is is a lot coming from a sour cream family, a white family. Excuse me. As white as it gets. No, and I think what you were talking about, Rose, about minorities becoming the majority, like I think a lot, like when people talk about like, oh, like we have this resurgence in white supremacy and like this is new and it's because of current politics, because of the current administration or something. And I think about what you said, Rose, that like I think it's been a long time coming. Like I think it's just been bottling up, and maybe this is like tip of the iceberg. But I think the white fragility in so much of, I mean, like in the middle of America or in older white folks who aren't willing to like, like address their latent racism and like address that, like what they're feeling about about this like shift in the majority. Like I think they're getting scared and they like want to hold on to that. And I think that's where that resurgence in, it's hard to say resurgence because like we talk about it like it's new when it's always been here, but it's just getting more sort of public, it's getting more organized, I think, rather than really being new. But I think it's attributed to that specifically, that shift in majority, more than it is in like in just like the current administration, like the last 4 years. Like that's been coming. And when the sad part is it's literally nothing to be afraid of, and they shouldn't be, but they are. But what was the topic proposed? What was before that? That was something I was going to talk about. I can't remember.
But I think that is another good point that you brought up, Jasmine, about the fear and like wanting to keep things the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, go on.
For me, it really goes back to like the labels and the narratives that are so ingrained that allows this, like we want to be comfortable, so we don't look at it too much. I don't know if anyone else feels that way.
I mean, yes, I think it's kind of a lot. I don't want to make assumptions, but people don't want to think about like society and have like existential crises on the daily. They want to focus about their family, and so I think some people are finding it challenging to now think about how their actions and reactions have an effect on society as a whole instead of like their immediate circle. And I think that's part of people educating themselves on what's happened and like putting it out there, like the documentary The 13th, and how that, used the book that we're speaking about as a kind of a pivotal moment of like learning about all these issues, and that incarceration is an extension of slavery. It's, everyone holds a responsibility to upkeeping that system that's really difficult to accept and digest and act counter, right? Like, how do you then, with that knowledge, you either accept it and try to do something about it, or you don't accept it, reject it, and say it's false, so that you can like keep up the status quo that you're so comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have this conversation, but my partner had this conversation with someone in his family, talking about Black Lives Matter. For someone who's, generally very open-minded and like liberal and like wants to learn things like that. And this person was saying, I'm sure that it's a worthy cause. I'm sure it's very important, but I am at a place in my life, like I have so many stresses with COVID and money and whatever, like I can't handle anything else. There's no room for anything else in my life. I can't take up a cause. And also, in addition, the other argument was, as important as social issues are, the most important issue that every single human on the planet is facing is climate change. And so what we should be doing is all rallying around climate change and leaving social issues to the back burner. And that can be a way for us to come together because it's more important of an issue. I think this is what they were trying to say. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I understand, I think, where you're coming from with these, because of course I agree climate issues are insanely important. Mm-hmm. And I understand individual stress can be surmounted to astronomical heights, right? But I tried to make an argument of, well, you would feel differently if you were Black. It's very easy for you to just set this aside because it's not directly impacting your life, but you could have the exact same life that you have with all of these stresses, and add on top of that you have two sons who are teenagers that could be very heavily affected by this, right? And so, I don't know, I just thought that was really interesting that even people that are well-meaning, it's still so easy to create a separation between yourself and the experiences of others.
I think like the privilege that we have to be able to separate, and those like microaggressions that we say that we're so unconscious of like, well, no, I have the privilege to separate myself from this. And then it goes back to as if we need to focus on one issue when like we should be thinking about all of this and how it affects all of us.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many times I like as a trans person have been mentioned, like I keep hearing about Harry Potter, right? and I keep hearing from the most well-meaning people, my closest friends. I mean, I think like 3 of like my best friends like are all like huge like Harry Potter fans and everything, and I keep seeing like so much. It's like, oh well, like the books have grown like so like far past like the writer, and the community has grown past the writer. Like it's more than that now. And I'm like, well, that's cool for you. But when I see Harry Potter now, all I think of is the fact that it's written by somebody who doesn't believe that I exist, right? Like I don't get to put that aside when I look at Harry Potter anymore. Like it comes to the front of my mind, and like I guess I'm glad that you can put that aside, but it's hard for me, and I don't want to like give my money to that, I guess. And that's a much less dramatic interpretation of the very same theory that you're both talking about. It's very true, and But that's what I've been, I guess, struggling with like over the last few months is like when I like get overwhelmed and I think like I will definitely, I'm a political junkie and I take in a lot of it and I know that gets to me and I know that's hard on my mental health and everything. And I'll have friends or even my therapist be like, well, you need to take less politics. You need to like take less of this. Like like you need to I guess like the idea of like just picking one issue sort of thing, right? And just worry about that one right now. And it gets tempting, like especially when you're a person who's privileged enough to not have to worry about those issues, right? But then but I think of that very thing as like, well, like I can just say like, oh, it's too stressful for me and so I'm not going to worry about police brutality. But it's like, but then there's people out there who are worrying about it every day, like you said, on top of a pandemic, on top of wildfires, on top of political corruption. And it's like, so like how can I continue to be an ally to this moment and give myself a break from it, right? Like I don't think it quite gets to fly that way.
But I think that's a good question, Jasmine, of like, how can I also be aware of like my mental health?
Sure.
And continue to be an ally. Like what small thing that will probably have a huge impact to someone. Like what you were sharing of your friends and what they were saying to you, well-meaning, but they didn't realize how it was hurtful to you and your experience.
Right. Yeah, there definitely has to be some sort of middle ground between my extremism of no days off, I guess, but not, you know, and where the other end is, you know, like, oh, well, I just need to, we'll put this on the back burner until we get, you know, the climate right, which we're not going to do in our lifetimes the rate we're going currently. We need to worry about those because they all intersect, right? Like none of these issues, like we're not going to address climate change without addressing like these.
I know that's another such huge point of like that I was thinking, you know, always after an argument. Also, I wasn't even in the argument, so just like right. Point somebody else's whatever. But I was saying that, you know, who's hit the hardest by climate change are poor people of color. And so, you know, I applaud you for caring about it as a middle class white person in the United States. But there are other people that would benefit a lot from caring about it as well if we were to aid them. So
we actually have a comment on that through our live, and they wrote to. So let me just read them. So it's from Hurricane7. That's such a cop out. I'm overwhelmed. I'm assuming that's to what we've been talking about. That's literally privileged to disconnect from racial issues. Wish I could disconnect from getting racially profiled and abused. Like, excuse me, racist sir, I'm too overwhelmed to deal with your mistreatment right now. Come harass me later. And I think that's kind of what we've been touching on. And then another great comment from the same person. Climate change is important, absolutely. So why remove the indigenous folks who would prevent forest fires by working their land? Climate change is connected to race because it's connected to monetary gain, which again loops back to race and power structures. And I think that's a really important point, that that conversation kind of omits that, like, that they're not separate issues. They do inform one another and are very much, as this person mentioned, like it's you know, it revolves around capitalism and how by having a disposable communities, you have disposable like land and rights, right? And yeah.
Yeah, that commenter was 2 steps ahead of us. Well done.
Yeah. Especially about indigenous communities. I mean, that's huge. My knowledge is so limited about indigenous life, modern day, like how people are functioning on the lands that were taken from them and all like the efforts to get them back. But even what I have learned in the last few years is like mind-boggling. And I was lucky enough to be at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival last year, where the 1491s wrote this show called Between Two Knees, which was amazing, and they like gave so much information there. But it's just insane to think how many people, myself included, up to now in my life, just skate by with no knowledge of anything about the land that they live on, about the history of the land, except like George Washington was here across the
Mhm.
Delaware River. It's like, wow, that's so irrelevant because that was 300 years ago. What happened 3,000 years ago here? You know, that kind
Yeah.
of stuff.
I'm with you. I think that's another part where, like, okay, that's another unconscious thing that I need to educate myself on. Um, because of the history how we're taught.
I guess that's, I mean, that's a solution, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
that we know that we were mistaught history, right? Like we were taught manifest destiny was a marvelous, amazing thing, and that's how the West was conquered or whatever bullshit, right? Like, I'll be right back.
It's so stupid I was muted.
The joys of Zoom.
I
Never remembering if you unmuted or.
I know. Like I said, I'm not used to it. I've been using Discord more this pandemic. um, I was trying to see if that commenter had mentioned anything else, but nope.
Or is there any other comments that stand out too as you're reading, Jasmine?
From the book?
No, from the comments that you're reading.
Oh no, it's just the same. Too.
Okay.
I was just checking.
But from the book too, if there's anything that stands out.
Oh right, also from the book.
Was there another like propaganda image you had, Brittany?
Yeah, I can find it.
Also, time has flown by. It's almost 4:50. So maybe after this discussion on the image. Whoa, okay.
Yeah. I think to me, seeing like from this baby up until the years of their life, and it's all leading to the prison, is so terrifying. And that we just allow it to continue.
Mm.
This kind of just looking at the image of the mother, that something I'm really excited for is to become a mother one day. And I was talking to one of my best friends about it, and he's a Black man, and I said, "Oh, I'm so excited to have kids. Like, what do you think? Like, do you want kids?" And his immediate reaction was, "I don't know if I have the emotional capacity to raise a Black child in this world." And I was like, oh my God, that's something I haven't even considered. You know what I mean? Like, all the things that come into parenthood that you're anxious about, like the actual delivery, and then are you going to feed him, and then blah, 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 you know, don't kill the child on accident in the first 6 months, don't drop him. But just the idea of that there's this whole extra layer of what the responsibility it means to be the parent of a Black child, something that is most likely inevitable if you yourself are Black, and so just trying to equate your own experience to what they might experience in the future, in such a horrific way. I don't know, it just really was impactful to me.
Yeah.
I read the 10th anniversary edition of the book, and something hoping to like talk about a little bit was kind of the transition the author mentioned about going from prisons, like physical buildings, to being virtual, and like that's how, like, to me that just sounds terrifying, right? But like hundreds, thousands of people with like ankle bracelets not being able to leave certain areas, right? So be whole neighborhoods being kept captive.
And it's like the craziest thing about all this, and it's not the craziest thing because there's too much crazy about it. But one of the crazy things about it is that this would be like, just this picture would be news to like most our country, like to most my family, to most of our friends, even like that. Yeah. It's just like of my family, like my mom only maybe like 3 years ago, I think around whenever the 13th documentary was released, and she watched it and she called me and she was like, holy crap, like slavery never ended. She's like probably the only person in my family like to recognize that at all, you know, like, but that's in my family, whereas like I think someone literally says it in the documentary that like, whereas Black people have known that their whole lives. And I don't know what I was watching, but they were talking about like that they have to have these conversations like with their kids when they're so young, and they like struggle with that conversation. And whereas my mom can go 50 years and not learn about it until then, you know, and I'm glad that she did learn about it. But that's just like I was saying, that this the fact that this book, you know, isn't required reading, you know, like how many more times can we read Julius Caesar and not this, or learn about Manifest Destiny? Is wild. This is just so much more, it's so much more useful. Like I feel like you're in school, especially in our generation, like really like concerned with like what's the practical application. Whereas, I mean, like this book is, and I mean, talk about its 10-year anniversary, is relevant every single year, and it was relevant 3 years before it was written, and at the rate we're going, it's going to be relevant our whole lives. Ugh.
And I think the fact you don't hear about it, I know I hadn't until, you know, I'm like, I need to read more to educate myself on being anti-racist and my biases, and the fact that it's not taught in schools. And it's like almost, it goes to that complacency and the accountability. And like, I think we're at the point where we need to all hold each other accountable to educate ourselves.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's a great place to end this one conversation so that people can continue it, right? Like,
yeah.
Because, I mean, we spent like what, like, I don't know.
About an hour.
Yeah. And I think we could keep going, but it's, you know.
It's just an hour getting into like what the book like evoked us to talk about, like relating to what's happening like literally today.
Yeah.
And that's just 1 hour before even getting into the, I mean, like specific like quotes in the book and everything. So, which is a testament to the book, that's for sure.
Any last thoughts anyone wants to share?
That I hope there isn't like the newest Jim Crow, right? That we can do something to stop the next iteration of this.
Hopefully we don't make this author write a sequel, right?
Yeah, but please.
sure she's got more than enough to write about today. But, well, I'm excited for the next book, though, because graphic novels are up my alley. That's my territory.
What was the book called again?
Yeah, the next book we're going to read is called Persepolis. And I'm really excited for it. Persepolis is by this woman named Marjane Satrapi. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it follows her life from age 10 to 14 during the Islamic Revolution. And so it follows her life. And as Jasmine mentioned, it's a graphic novel of what it meant to be a child growing up in this Islamic Revolution, like not understanding what's happening, but still being under the control of the regime. And then also her escape to France, going to school, and just kind of like coming to terms with her identity, both as a woman and as someone from the Middle East, and grappling with all of these political ideas and how it shaped her as a person. I think it's an incredible book, so I'm excited that we're diving into it.
Yeah, it sounds like a really good book. I can't wait to read it.
And it's a graphic novel. It's like so interesting, you know.
And then we'll be posting more information on that on our Instagram, which if you're on Twitch, it'll be in the profile, but it's in the Margin Theater, as well as we have our website, which is www.inthemargintheater.org. And yeah, so we should be posting some more information on that fairly soon.
Thanks for having this discussion with me. That was really fun.
Yeah, it's nice.
It's also just nice to spend more time together, like getting to know each other a little bit better.
Yeah.
That's great.
We can't do it in person. I'd really like to do it in person eventually. I miss in
If you do,
person.
I will provide snacks.
Yay.
Yes.
I'm very good at snacks. I'm a mom in the making. I already told you, so.
Fantastic.
Sounds good. I can't wait.
Can't wait to go to New York. That's gonna be amazing.
Yeah. I mean, I want to be back there already, so even more so.
Yes.
I want to go anywhere but these four walls.
Yeah, that's a good, I guess, checkout question. Where would you go?
How about anywhere? Is anywhere a good answer? No, yeah. I mean, being in quarantine really makes you take anything for granted. Like,
Mhm.
I think just a few months ago, it's already a few months ago, maybe a couple months ago, I had like just two friends come up for like I literally gave them like a quarantine, like drive-through tour of the Bay Area. And I was like, wow, there's so much art and beauty in the Bay Area that I've never even been to. And I grew up here for 18 years. And it was like, so literally just like 17 minutes away from my house is where I'd want to go to, I guess.
I think it's really important is to explore your local history because try not to focus on like Eurocentric narratives, right? Like,
Yeah.
why? I mean, it's cool to go to Rome, but there's such a rich history on this land that we're failing to explore because we're not taught about it.
Right.
And I think it's about time that we learn about it.
I agree.
I agree too.
Brittany, where would you go?
New York, because very much like Jasmine, even though I'm not from there, I was living there and like I didn't take advantage of it fully. So like I guess going to like the local things that are there that I'm like, oh yeah, I'll get to go there next month or whatever, and then this happened. What about you, Rose?
I've been very lucky in this pandemic in that I got to spend the summer in Colorado with my family. So that was really beautiful. And then now we're back in New York, which is really nice. But we were supposed to take a trip to Korea this summer in April for my partner to meet my family And my mom and I started a tradition that we go every 2 years, and so we weren't able to go. So that's where I'd like to be.
What about you, Fran? Or was it just the local that you were mentioning?
Yeah, just a local and kind of what you mentioned, just taking advantage of like I miss like poetry readings or like just going to a coffee shop, you know, like those little things that like I would go to when I had time. They're very much in need right now. Those are like rejuvenating things I would go to where I would, yeah, just like little events. I miss those.
Seriously, I realize I miss work. And granted, I work in a cool theater in Little Tokyo, but I miss that a lot. I get you. I miss that environment. An open mic sounds nice.
All right.
So I guess we're signing off. So thank you those who stuck around virtually on Twitch and commented and added to our conversation. And yeah, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you next time.
Thanks. Graphic novel.